Hi, I'm Ray. Welcome to my channel where I make gentle daily life vlogs and talk about literature. Today I'm going to be answering the questions in the Modern Classics tag. This was created by Milena over at Milena Reads. She has an absolutely fantastic channel where she talks about feminism, historical fiction, literary fiction. I highly recommend that you check her out. I'll link her channel and the original tag down below. So without any further ado, let's get started. First question is, what is the definition of a modern classic to you? So I'm going to split this into two parts. What is a classic? Obviously this is like a humongous topic. It goes without saying that there is no right answer to this, but some of the thoughts that I have on what is a classic. To me, a classic work of literature is something which gets at the core of what it means to be a human being. They speak to your soul, they're clever, and you get some of the cleverness, but you're also aware that there's stuff in there that you could do more research into, that you could read it again and you could get more from it on a second reading, that somebody else reading it might get something very different from it to what you get from it. And there's just this kind of general sense that here is something which is worth more than the sum of its parts. Okay, so what's a modern classic? After a bit of a reflection, I've decided to draw the slightly random line at 1914. My gut response was kind of, oh, let's go 1900. But I feel like a lot of the literature written between 1900 and 1914, all of those kind of Edwardian classics, to me they still feel closer to Victorian than they do to modern. I think in Western literature anyway, there is a sense that the First World War was a sort of watershed moment, and that is represented in literature. A lot of the kind of euphemisms were abandoned because there simply was no way to convey the reality of the lived experience in the war without being explicit. Now, obviously that's a massive generalization, but I do think that you can feel a difference between literature written pre-1914 and literature written post-1914, and so that would be my definition of a modern classic. One final thing that I wanted to tuck into my definition of a modern classic. I mentioned that a classic has lasting value. It kind of addresses the essence of what it means to be a human being in the world. And for me, a modern classic simultaneously addresses this kind of eternal quality, but also the current. So some books that do this really well, in my opinion. Weightlifting. Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials, and I'm gonna hold up because they're easier to hold. This follows on with his Book of Dust trilogy, 2 out of 3 of which are currently out. So in these works, on the one hand, you have one of the most eternally addressed topics in literature, the dialogue between the soul and the body. You probably know this already, but in the world that these books are set in, people's souls exhibit as demons. They're called as like an animal, like a spirit animal, which is physically separate from your body. They draw a lot on works like John Milton's Paradise Lost. There's loads of fascinating kind of older and eternal issues addressed in here. But at the same time, they look at issues like climate change, like the individual against the institution, like refugees, like human trafficking. I think subjects which are very close to our modern consciousness and which are very current. And that to me is writing which I really happily would place in the category of a modern classic. Second question is your favourite subgenre in modern classics. I'd say probably coming of age, is that a genre? I have a lot of kind of classic comfort literature that falls within this genre. So we have, for example, I Capture the Castle by Dodie Smith. Yes, I did just want to have an excuse to take that out of its dust jacket. Isn't it beautiful? This is an absolutely gorgeous diary-style coming-of-age novel about a young girl who lives in a tumble-down castle with her extremely eccentric family, and it's just like the best of British eccentricity. It begins famously and wonderfully. I write this sitting in the kitchen sink. That is, my feet are in it. The rest of me is on the draining board, which I have padded with our dog's blanket and the tea cozy. There's my picture as well. Doing my primary school teacher bit. I also really love Eva Ibbetson's work and more memoir stuff, which also feels like coming of age. So like Lark to Candleford by Flora Thompson, Cider with Rosie by Laurie, A London Child of the 1870s. I think my selection of favourite modern classics is probably quite illustrative of why I generally read older books, because a lot of the modern classics which I really love are the ones that feel a little bit more like older books. I mean, A London Child of the 1870s obviously is a reflection on being a child in the Victorian era. Likewise to Candleford, Cider with Rosie. They're books about a landscape which is disappearing, and they're kind of capturing the very final heydays of a kind of rural, traditional way of life. I think there's something really beautiful and poignant about those works of literature which appreciate that the past is being lost and try desperately to hold on to it and to preserve it for the future. Those are kind of my go-to modern classics, and definitely that kind of book is a book that I love to come around to again and again because it just gives me so much comfort and joy. I'd also like to include in this coming of age genre works which aren't such comfort literature, something like The Colour Purple, which is an incredible work for many reasons, but one of those many reasons is the fact that I think it shows that the coming of age genre doesn't need to stop age 21, and that actually coming of age is a lifelong process. Question number 3 is an author from the 20th century whose works you would recommend. For this, I'm going to go for Anthony Powell. He was the author of A Dance to the Music of Time, quartet / series of 12, depending on how you read them. There's 4 kind of seasons, each of 3 books, and this is an incredible series of work. It's such a massive investment, but it's so worth it. What Powell basically does is, through the eyes of a protagonist, Nick, he basically takes us through a lifetime in the 20th century. So it begins, I think, with Nick as a schoolboy in the 1910s, and it goes up to the 1960s when he is an older man. And it just looks at the way that British society changes over that time period. What's really interesting about it is that Nick is very much just the eyes through which we see the society. And it's much more about the people in his life who come and go, what the social world looks like in upper middle class London throughout that time period, rather than what his interior world looks like. It's very whatever the opposite of introspective is. I have never read anything like it. I listened to these as audiobooks in the car. I think it was like 80 hours worth of listening when I used to do an hour's commute to and from work. And I just remember the whole series with such fondness. I was so sad to get to the end of them. And the thing that he does really phenomenally is have these characters who like drift in and out of life the way that people drift in and out of your own life. And so you'll meet a character sometimes for like 5 minutes in book 2, and then there'll be like the central character of book 11, or somebody might be an enormous part of his early life and then fade into non-existence, and he bumps into them once when he's coat shopping in London like 30 years later. It's just really clever, it's really well done, it's phenomenally written, and if you're interested in that historical period of British history, you just get immersed completely in it. Could not recommend them highly enough. Question number 4 is your favourite modern classic this year so far. I'm glad that I'm answering these questions at this point in the year, because when Milena first tagged me in, I actually didn't have a favourite modern classic of the year. Like, I just couldn't bring myself to say any of the modern classics that I'd read, because none of them were really good enough. But fortunately now, I can come to you having just finished John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. This is the story of a family who migrate across America to California during the Great Depression of the 1930s. It's the stories of the hardships and the injustices that they face, and of their attempts to support each other and to support the other people around them throughout the discrimination that they experience. It's beautifully written, and I feel like it's really illustrative of what I was saying about a modern classic being at once current and universal, because it is clearly very much of a time. It's talking about this specific incident, but we also are presented with a family of people who very much reflect us and who feel like a family that we know, that we see ourselves and our friends and our family in. In this sense, it is at once very time-specific and very timeless. Number 5, a modern classic that surprised you. For this, I have to say The Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess, which was written in 1962. It's a dystopian fiction which talks about this world where ultra-violent crime is absolutely rife, and we follow along the protagonist Alex, who's just a total thug. He gets an absolute kick out of committing violent and sadistic acts. It's generally an all-around horror. I thought that I would hate this book because I don't really like violence, I don't really like scary stuff. However, I was just blown away by this novel. The book explores Alex's reformation, and in so doing, it just delves into this really fascinating question about crime and punishment, how much of a right we have to self-determination if we're a criminal, how much power the state ought or ought not to have in reformation. It looks at the police versus the criminals. And yeah, it was just thematically a lot more interesting than I expected it was going to be. Also, the whole thing is written in this slang language called Nadsat, which is like a cross between English and Russian slang. And so you end up understanding the story probably in a similar way that you would do like if you're reading Shakespeare or something, where you do get the gist of it, like you can tell what it's saying, but there are a lot of individual words in there that you don't know what they mean. And it creates this kind of poetic effect, which is almost a bit dizzying, almost a bit sickening. It ties in with the theme of the novel really well. You get into the flow of it really surprisingly easily. It makes the violence feel less blatant and more literary, which I was a fan of as somebody who doesn't enjoy explicit violent scenes. It's a really short book, but really interesting. It was one of my read a book on a flight books, and I was very pleasantly surprised. Number 6, a modern classic that was disappointing to you. I don't know whether this counts as disappointing, but I'm going to say Slaughterhouse 5 by Kurt Vonnegut, which is a book that I had to study for A-level, and I can't really legitimately say it was disappointing because I went into it with absolutely no expectations, but I'm disappointed in the role that it played in my own reading of modern classics because I really didn't like this book. It's a story about this protagonist, Billy the Pilgrim, during the Second World War, and it jumps time-wise like throughout his life, including how at some point in his life he ends up like watching the Earth being destroyed in a rocket with some aliens or something. There's like some aliens in it for some of it, and I think it's simultaneously telling a message about the horrors of World War II, as well as exploring the topic of determinism and whether we have control over our lives or whether we don't. Can't really remember, but I do just remember how intensively I disliked it, and I do kind of blame it for the fact that I have avoided quite a lot of modern literature, because if I pick up something that was written in the Victorian period, I'm just a lot more confident that I'm going to enjoy it than I am if I pick up a modern classic. And I think the dread is always in me that it might be another Slaughterhouse 5. Number 7, a modern classic that you would like to reread. Everything Angela Carter. Actually, especially I would like to reread Wise Children. This I also read for A-level with the same teacher who made me read Slaughterhouse 5, and while I loathed Slaughterhouse 5, Wise Children was one of the best things that I had ever read. For a year or two after I read it, I think somebody asked me what my favourite novel was, I probably would have said Wise Children. And it's now been so long since I read it that I can't even really remember the plot. It's about a couple of elderly twins who lived their lives in the theatre. I love theatre books. It's definitely a sort of subgenre of writing that I really enjoy. I did an absolute ton of ballet and performance as a child, and really anything that manages to capture the magic of being backstage or on the stage when the curtain's going up, or even of being in the audience, just like totally gets me. I know that in Wise Children there was just like an absolute ton of Shakespeare references throughout. It was really funny, really witty, also a bit magical realism. But yeah, Angela Carter, I feel like at some point I'll reread something by her and it will just send me onto like an Angela Carter binge and I'll read everything. And I'm looking forward to that day. Number 8, a recent release that you think will be a modern classic in decades to come. I already kind of did Philip Pullman's Dark Materials. So I'm going to take this opportunity to talk a bit about a book that I read this year that I adored so much, but which I don't feel has necessarily got the traction that it deserves. I haven't heard it spoken about that much, and also to my sorrow I've recommended it to quite a few of my friends and they have not been as moved by it as I was. Anyway, this book is Do Not Say We Have Nothing by Madeleine Thane. I read this in January. It's a multi-generational family saga set both in Canada but largely in China during the Cultural Revolution. It explores these different characters' experiences of life. In some parts it's quite whimsical, in many parts it's utterly heartbreaking, extremely depressing, but throughout it's consistently beautifully written. A lot of the main characters in it are musicians. There's quite a musical feel to the writing, to the plot even. You get the sense of having read a symphony, like all of the different stories of the different characters' lives kind of chime in harmony to one another and complement each other. It just explores loads of fascinating issues like memory, like history being warped through people's memories, through recordings, the importance of written recordings. It talks about refugees who get lost within the system in America. It talks about the atrocities which occurred during the Cultural Revolution, and yeah, I read it in January. It was the best thing that I read in January, and hands down it's still the best thing that I read this year. It's one of those books that I still think about. Like for a few months after I read it, I was still thinking about it every day, and now I'm still probably thinking about it like at least once a week. It just pops back into my head. I had so much emotional connection to the characters and so much investment in the plots. It took a little piece of my heart away with it when I finished it. Number 9, the next modern classic on your TBR. I'm currently participating in the 1900 to 1950 readathon, so everything that I'm reading at the moment is a modern classic, which is quite handy. This video should also be up during the 1900 to 1950 readathon, so nicely topical. Next modern classic on my TBR is Titus Groan by Mervyn Peake. This is the first book in his Gormenghast trilogy, which are this series of fantasy books about this epic sprawling castle of Gormenghast. It's written in a very Dickensian style. It's elaborately descriptive. The characters are super weird, but they all kind of work within the context. I'm about to go and read it now. Okay, and my last question is just to tag 3 classics lovers to do these questions if you would like to. I tag Alice in the Giant Bookshelf, M with Books and Brushes, and the last one is just an open invitation to anybody who watches my channel and has an interest in modern classics. Please let me know if you do choose to do the tag. I'd be really interested to hear your answers, and I know Milena would too. Do comment down below your favourite modern classic and or your thoughts on any of these questions. Don't forget to like, subscribe and click the bell for notifications when I post a video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you very soon in another bookish video. Bye bye.